Let's continue our series in the book of Ruth. I should add that all of these messages are online at our website, so if you miss one, you can go back and watch it. Let me review for a moment. Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth had returned to Bethlehem from Moab. Remember, both women had been widowed. Ruth knew that she and Naomi would need food, so she went to work as a gleaner in the fields during the barley harvest. Remember, ancient Israel had a work welfare system. The landowner servants, the servants of the landlord, were responsible to go into the fields and cut down the grain. And in doing that, those servants were instructed to leave some grain standing in the corners of the field. That was important. And then they were to leave whatever had been dropped or whatever had been missed during the harvesting process. The poor people would then get permission to glean in the field, and would harvest all the remaining viable grain. Ruth went to a particular field that a man named Boaz owned. It turns out that Boaz is related to Ruth, as we're going to see. Boaz was probably her deceased husband's brother. Boaz was a rich man. So Naomi encouraged Ruth to just remain in the fields that Boaz owned and glean beside his reapers. I should mention that Boaz, at this time, seems to have developed a serious romantic interest in Ruth. That brings us to Ruth chapter 2 and starting at verse 8. Ruth 2 and verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women." Verse 9. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So Boaz said to Ruth, "Don't leave this field," meaning the field he owned. "Don't leave this field. Don't go to work in another field and find grain. Stay right here and work beside my women." Boaz wanted Ruth to follow his reapers throughout the field. Then Boaz instructed his male servants not to harass Ruth or even touch her, but if Ruth was thirsty, she was to go to Boaz's servants and ask for something to drink. It is so apparent that Ruth was receiving extraordinary special attention from Boaz. No one else would have been permitted this sort of freedom in a rich man's field. She was a person of privilege. No one else had it so good. Verse 10, so she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes? Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Ruth couldn't understand why all this was happening. And so she fell on her knees, touched her forehead to the ground, and asked Boaz, why was he doing this for her? Verse 11, and Boaz answered and said to her, "It has been faithfully or fully reported to me, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before." Verse 12, "The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Please notice Boaz's answer to Ruth's question as to why he was doing all of this. He didn't go, "I'm doing this, Ruth, because I love you, babe. I do." That didn't happen. That wasn't his response at that moment, but that is going to happen. I should add, no fair reading ahead. Just wherever I stop, you stop. Verse 13, then she said, "Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." So Ruth thanked Boaz for his kindness. Verse 14, now Boaz said to her at mealtime, come here and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied and kept some back. Boaz then invited Ruth to dinner, and she accepted. But don't misunderstand this. This was not a romantic meal per se. But it seems Boaz had started to get interested. Boaz was attracted to Ruth. But if that is true, and if Boaz does have a love interest in Ruth, then please notice something. Boaz was moving slow. If he did have a romantic interest, he didn't want to come on too strong and frighten Ruth. So he was being careful and discreet, which is always a recommended practice if we're pursuing a mate. That approach reminded me of a man from one of our former congregations who was not so careful and cautious. I learned that on the first date, this gentleman made this crazy statement to this woman. In the middle of the date, he said, I don't know how it's going to happen. I don't know when it's going to happen, but at some point, we're going to be married. Remember, this is on the first date. And she responded, are you crazy? You don't even know me. And he answered, it doesn't matter that I don't know you. God does, and we're going to be married. 5.5 months after that initial conversation, they were married, and I understand still are. Now, for all the eligible young men in this room who at some point will consider marriage, that is not a recommended practice. If you're interested in a second date, then don't announce to the girl on the first date that you're going to marry her. I mean, all you'll do is freak her out, actually. Be more like Boaz. Go slow, go careful, be cautious, don't be so obvious. Verse 15, and when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Verse 16, also let grain fall from the bundles, meaning the bundles of grain the reapers have accumulated. Let grain fall from the bundles, fall purposely for her. Notice, let the grain from the bundles fall on purpose for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. Remember, to glean the fields meant to pick up leftover grain still in the fields after the harvest. That's what Ruth had been doing. She was a gleaner. Boaz commanded his servants to let Ruth glean anywhere she wanted in the field. Then he told those servants to purposely let some of the grain that they had just harvested fall back to the ground. This is interesting. According to Jewish law, the servants were not permitted to pick up any grain that might have been dropped. They were to leave that grain. That dropped grain was to be left for poor gleaners. That was because permitting gleaners in the field was part of ancient Israel's welfare system, as we mentioned last time. Once more, notice. This is a work welfare system. The poor had to literally glean the fields for themselves. There weren't handouts. No, that's not how it was. If the poor people wanted leftover grain, then those people had to go into the field and glean it themselves. Remember, it was a work welfare system, and it was effective, and a work welfare system would still be effective if we would require that from able-bodied, able-minded welfare recipients. Boaz instructed his servants to drop grain on purpose so Ruth could find it. Remember, the servants weren't permitted to pick up dropped grain, to leave it so Ruth could find it. Boaz said that his servants were to be negligent on purpose. This is purpose-driven negligence. And this is so Ruth could find more grain to pick up. Those servants were told to be discreet in doing this so Ruth would notice. Remember, Ruth didn't know about these instructions from Boaz to his reapers. So she was probably thinking that these servants were just real sloppy reapers because they're grain all over. Verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening. and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. So Ruth continued to glean until the sun started to go down. Then she beat out the barley she had gathered up. That meant she separated the straw and the chaff from the actual grain, because only the head of the grain was edible. The stalk of straw and the chaff were discarded and thrown out. So after beating out the grain, she had left about an ephah of barley. An ephah is about 9/10 of a bushel. I should mention U.S. farmers still raise barley today. It is this nation's fourth largest crop, behind maize, then rice, then wheat. Now, if maize sounds unfamiliar, maize is corn. Maize, it's called maize in Great Britain, but here it's called corn. Now, just to give you an idea how much actual collected, to put this into perspective, remember when the Israelites wandered around in the wilderness and God fed them manna from heaven. The daily portion of manna allotted to each Hebrew was 1/10 of an ephah. 1/10 of an ephah per person per day, and God considered that adequate nourishment. That meant a whole ephah would have fed 10 people in one day. So Ruth brought home almost one full ephah of barley, almost one entire bushel of barley, which would have been able to feed both Ruth and Naomi for about 5 consecutive days. This was so extremely unusual, because on a normal basis, no one person would be able to glean that much grain in one day. Ruth brought home, after one day's work, enough grain to feed 10 people for an entire day. And that all happened because Boaz arranged for his servants to drop handfuls of grain onto the ground on purpose so she could find them. Do we understand, although not married at this point in time, do we understand that Boaz is already demonstrating the characteristics of a biblical husband? A biblical husband is to do 3 things to the woman he is married to. He is to be a protector, a provider, and a priest. Or because we aren't Catholic, it's protector, provider, and pastor. In verse 9, Boaz instructed his servants to not mistreat her. That's being a protector. Then in verses 15 and 16, he instructed his servants to be sure she was able to get over and above the average amount of grain someone could glean. That was being a provider. And after marriage to Ruth, he would be the priest or pastor, meaning Boaz would be the spiritual head of the home. Gentlemen, we are to be those same 3 things to our mate. We are to be a protector, we are to be a provider, and we are to be a priest or pastor. Let me illustrate that. 42 months ago, our youngest son, Brian, found a used Lexus for his mother. A 2014 ES 300 hybrid. I like the hybrid part, but with just 37,000 miles on it. And Hopi was all excited to get this car, but Hopi needed to trade in her Honda and then pay the difference for the Lexus. The problem was that the car was at a dealership in San Diego, some 500 miles from our house. Now, for those of you who don't know Hopi, she's an independent, self-sufficient woman. She would never admit this, but she doesn't need me. I need her. If something happens to her, I'm in serious trouble. I need her, but she needs me like a hole in the head. I still remember someone once introduced us to someone we had never met and said, "This is Hope, and this is hopeless." And personally, I was offended, but anyway. So Hopi said she would drive the 10+ hours to San Diego to trade in her car, purchase the Lexus to complete the transaction. I had commitments at church, so I couldn't join her. But I said, "Hopi, you are not driving to San Diego alone." Something unexpected could happen during that trip. There could be an accident, and you could be incapacitated, and if so, then you will need someone there to call 911. I said, you're not going to drive alone. So she brought a close female friend with her, and the two of them had a fantastic time. They not only got the car, but they got to go tour the aircraft carrier, the Midway, and got to attend David Jeremiah's congregation on Saturday night. So the fact I wasn't there did not interfere with their time at all. But that wasn't me being hyper controlling. No, that was me being a protector. Verse 18, then she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So he brought out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. Verse 19, and her mother-in-law said to her, where have you gleaned today? And where did you work? Blessed is the one who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Verse 20, then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, notice, this man, meaning Boaz, is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. Ruth brought home this barley she had gleaned and probably made some sort of cakes, and she fed Naomi. Then after Naomi had eaten the barley loaves, she asked Ruth where she had gleaned the barley. Ruth said it was in a field that belonged to a man named Boaz. And Naomi was so excited to hear that, and she immediately announced that Boaz was related to them. As we said earlier, Boaz was probably Elimelech's brother, meaning her deceased husband's brother. And if so, that meant Boaz would have been Naomi's brother-in-law. The Hebrew word that is translated at the end of verse 20, the word translated as relative, one of our close relatives, that word is goel. G-O-E-L, goel. Goel is mentioned 23 times in this small book of Ruth. It is mentioned more times proportionally than in any other book of the Bible. The Hebrew word goel was used to describe someone's nearest living blood male relative. One more time. Goel describes someone's nearest living blood male relative. And Boaz was actually not the nearest. He was actually the second, not the first, but the second nearest living blood relative, as we are going to see. Verse 21, and I'm reading a lot of text today, so I'm not getting stuck after 3 verses, so I should get credit for this. Anyway, verse 21, Ruth the Moabitess said, he also said to me, you shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. Verse 22, and Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that people do not meet you in any other field. Verse 23, so she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. So Ruth said that Boaz had asked her to return to the field in the morning where she had been gleaning and continue to glean beside his reapers until the entire field was harvested. Naomi said, after hearing this, Naomi said that she should take full advantage of that opportunity. So Ruth did that and gleaned throughout the remainder of the barley harvest. And then she continued to glean throughout the entire wheat harvest also. She and Naomi continued to live together, and God continued to meet their basic needs. Now, from this point on, Boaz becomes the principal character throughout the remainder of this book. So this morning, let's extract from this second chapter 3 basic statements or 3 basic observations that characterized Boaz. 1, Boaz was sensitive to what God expected from him. Boaz was sensitive. to what God expected from him. Verse 11, and Boaz answered and said to her, "It has been fully reported to me." Now Boaz is speaking to Ruth. "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and have come to a people whom you did not know before." Verse 12, "The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." So Boaz, and we don't know how he knew, but Boaz had heard how Ruth had left everyone, all of her relatives. She left everyone and everything behind in Moab in order to move to Bethlehem. Boaz had also heard how kind she had been to his sister-in-law, Naomi, and how committed she was to care for Naomi, since Naomi was an older woman. Boaz prayed that God would bless Ruth because of what she had done and what she was still doing. But Boaz also realized that God expected him to be a contributing part to that blessing. Boaz understood how difficult it would be for Ruth to find employment as a Gentile alien in a foreign Jewish environment such as Bethlehem. And being aware of that situation made him more sensitive to what God expected him to do about Ruth and Naomi's financial needs. Boaz realized that as a rich landowner, he was in a position to bless Ruth. All of us have been blessed. All of us. The one person in this room that has the least has been blessed. We are all blessed in comparison to the rest of the human population. And remember, we are blessed to be a blessing. We are blessed to be a blessing. It is a biblical principle that God blesses us so that in turn we can be a blessing to others. God's blessings come to us, but those blessings shouldn't stop at us. Instead, those blessings should go on through us and on to someone else. In modern language, we call that paying it forward. There's a 2000 movie that had that same name, Paying It Forward. In the New Testament, Jesus said in Luke 12, verse 48, "For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required. And to whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more." Because he was rich, he was a man of some financial means. Because he was rich, Boaz had been given much. God had blessed him. And so God expected him to give away much. And he was sensitive to that divine expectation. He sensed an immediate urge from God to assist Ruth and enable her to glean much more grain than would be considered normal. But to do that so as not to arouse suspicion or embarrassment. There are some expectations from God that are common to all Christians, and those are specifically mentioned in Scripture. But there are other expectations that do not concern all Christians. God might have expectations from me that he doesn't expect from someone else. Or he might expect something from you that he doesn't expect from me. The secret to being sensitive to what God's expectations for us are is to redirect our focus from off ourselves and onto God. The secret to being sensitive to God's expectations for us are to redirect our focus from off ourselves and onto God. The more we are able to focus on God, the more sensitive we are going to be to what God is expecting from us. Second statement, Boaz acted on what God expected for him. Boaz, after he determined what he felt God wanted, he acted on that. Verse 15, "And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her.' Verse 16, 'Also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her, Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. Please understand that Boaz wasn't just sensitive to God's expectations for him, but he was determined to act on and fulfill those expectations. Please notice that he instructed his servants to, on purpose, drop additional grain on the ground so that Ruth could find it and glean it for herself. It's most interesting that this entire book, from Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, through Ruth 4, verse 22, can be summed up in this one phrase from verse 16. And that phrase is, I suggest you underline this, also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. This incredible book called Ruth is not a chain of lucky events. This is not a series of most fortunate incidents. No, these are handfuls of blessings that God on purpose had prepared for Ruth. It was no accident. Ruth wandered onto a field that belonged to Boaz. It was no accident that Boaz showed up at this field on the particular afternoon Ruth happened to be there. And if Boaz hadn't shown up that afternoon, she probably would have gone to another field the next day, and in doing so would have completely missed meeting Boaz. It was no accident that Boaz noticed Ruth immediately and then invited her to dinner. It was no accident that Boaz permitted Ruth to glean so close to the reapers. It was no accident that Boaz instructed his servants to drop handfuls of grain for Ruth to find and glean. It was no accident that Boaz permitted Ruth to continue to glean in his fields throughout both the barley harvest and then the wheat harvest. Those weren't accidents. Those weren't coincidences. Those were handfuls of purpose, on purpose from God. And Boaz was an active participant in that purposeful agenda. Boaz acted in obedience to God's expectation. And it didn't matter to him what it cost him. In the beginning, it cost him the minimal loss of some financial profit, because the grain that he could have sold at the market, he essentially gave away to Ruth. It cost him that. But it would cost him even more at the end of this book, because Boaz was going to agree to redeem something. Redeem means to repurchase something, to buy back something. Boaz would agree to redeem or purchase the land Ruth's deceased father-in-law had owned, Elimelech's land. And he would redeem it. He would purchase it for himself. And in addition, Boaz would agree to be married to Ruth. And men in particular understand that marriage costs serious money. It is true that two can live together as cheap as one, but only as long as one of them doesn't eat. Someone said to his friend, "So how do you meet your expenses?" His friend said, "How do I meet my expenses? Simple. My wife introduces me to them. That's how I meet them." Some of you are really, really slow. Really slow. Need to work on that, okay? I've got a thing of 5-hour energy in my attaché case. I'll give it to you after the service. It can be said that sin conceptually fits into two basic categories: sins of commission and sins of omission. Sins of commission is doing what we are not supposed to do. If the speed limit is 55 and we prefer 85, then that is a sin, because we are doing what we are not supposed to do. Speeding tickets, I remember I've only had one speeding ticket in more than 4 decades. Not that I haven't deserved more, but I've only had one. We had just come to Nevada, and I was out, I don't know, along Foothill. There's wide open fields, and I didn't know what the speed limit was, didn't see a sign, so I was just driving, and then a Nevada state trooper pulled me over and said, "You were going 65 and a 55, and I said, "I had no idea." And so he's writing me up, and I said, "Do you know, I have not had a ticket in 27 years. And he said, Well, I guess it's about time. No mercy. Sins of omission. Sins of omission is not doing what we are supposed to do. We covered this in our series through James. James 4, verse 17. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Let's consider some examples of that. Someone has been missing from church for more than a month, and we notice that absenteeism. We know this person, but then we don't bother to call them or email them or text them and tell them we miss them. James said, therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Our church has financial needs, and our needs will increase during the construction of our building. And we rationalize that someone else can meet those needs. And so we contribute nothing or almost nothing. James said, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. We're aware that a guest is sitting alone at the beginning of a service. And because we use the excuse, it feels awkward, we don't approach them and greet them and help them feel welcome. Again, he who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Someone wants us to pray for them, and we agree to do that. But then we forget about that prayer request and don't pray for them. To him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Research shows that more than 65% of unchurched people, 65% of unchurched people would attend a church service if someone would invite them. But we never get around to doing that. We never invite them. We never invite someone to be our guest at a service. Shame on us. To him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. As a congregation, we understand the need to reach emerging generations, but we stand our ground and hold on to our traditions and our sacred cows and our personal preferences and refuse to be culturally relevant. To him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. The biggest problem in the church is not that we're doing stuff that we shouldn't do, although sometimes that does happen and that needs to be addressed. But the biggest problem is we're not doing the stuff that we should be doing. Some time ago, I received an announcement that our neighbor in Kansas City, next door neighbor, had died at age 90. He was our next door neighbor for about 45 years. And he was an extremely nice man. It's interesting. I started cleaning my father's church in the 5th grade, so I was employed there. But he was my first employer other than the church. He owned a window and awning business, and he hired me part-time from the 6th grade through high school. And he wasn't stingy on his compensation. He was extremely good to me. His name was Mr. Robert Wegley. And each time we would go home to Kansas City, we would see him and chat. But one of the last times I would see him, could have been the last time, God had put inside of me this incredible compulsion to speak to him about Jesus. There was no question, but it was what God expected from me. And so as Boaz did, I determined to act in obedience to that expectation. I knocked on his door, and he immediately invited me in. And we sat down together, and we engaged in some small talk. And then I said, Mr. Wegley, the real reason I'm here is to talk to you about heaven. I don't know if I'm ever going to see you again on this earth because I'm pastoring in Northern California, and we don't get home that much. But I just have to know that we're going to be in heaven together. And he told me that sometime earlier, he had attended a revival service at a non-denominational Christian church in southern Missouri. And he wanted me to know that he had responded to the invitation that night. and he prayed to receive Jesus. And I reviewed the gospel for him because I wanted him to fully understand what he said he had done. Now, no one knows for certain about someone else's salvation, but because of his response to me, I'm hoping to see Mr. Wegley in heaven. But I had to do that. I knew God expected it from me. I had to do it. And I'm grateful I did. That is a credible example of acting in obedience to an expectation God has for me. But most Christians don't do that. Most Christians set a limit on personal obedience. Most Christians are obedient to a certain point, but then are disobedient past that point. Some Christians might consider making a financial contribution, but don't consider a tithe. Tithe is 10%. To me, a tithe is minimal. The minimal amount of our money we should give to God. I believe in proportionate giving, so I believe as God blesses us, we need to up our blessing, meaning our contribution to God in amount and percentage. I have taught that for over 5 decades. Some might attend church services, but don't actually serve in some capacity. Some purchase recommended study Bibles, but then don't read them. Some speak if spoken to, but then don't do small group Bible studies because small group Bible studies are more intimate and relational. And on and on and on. I have a series of questions. What if Noah had said, I don't do arks? What if Moses had said, I don't do leadership? What if David had said, I don't do giants? What if Daniel had said, I don't do lions' dens? What if Joshua had said about Jericho, I don't do massive fortified cities? What if Mary had said, I don't do stables? What if Paul had said, I don't do Gentiles? And what if Jesus had said, I don't do crosses? What if those people had refused to do what God expected them to do? What if Ethan and Lindsay Everson had said, we don't do impoverished children in Mexico? What if Spence and Jaylene McConnell had said, we don't do pastor training in Mexico? But both couples were obedient to fulfill those particular expectations that God had for them and should be commended for doing that. I'm proud of them both. Statement 3, Boaz ultimately benefited from doing what God expected from him. Boaz ultimately benefited from doing what God expected from him. I need to be careful not to divulge too much and give away the ending to this story. So this third part is to be continued. But the point is that there are definite positive benefits from personal obedience. Remember this principle. I've shared this before. Obedience to God brings blessings from God. Obedience to God brings blessings from God. Those blessings and benefits could be material or health-related or financial, or those benefits could be spiritual. We do receive some of those benefits and blessings here on this earth. But most of those benefits and most of those blessings are going to be waiting for us in heaven. Matthew 5, verse 11. Let me read this in context. Blessed are you when they revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Jesus was addressing people who were being persecuted, slandered, persecuted. Verse 12, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward. Where? Great is your reward in heaven. In the Old Testament, obedience often brought someone tangible benefits during someone's lifetime. Read Deuteronomy chapter 28 sometime. That's an interesting text. Deuteronomy 28 is full of blessings and benefits from obedience. But during the New Testament age, obedience and immediate, tangible, and material blessings are not always connected to this lifetime. Sometimes yes, and sometimes not. If that were the case, then good and obedient people would all become rich, and suffering would only be symptomatic of someone's sin. But that isn't true. Most obedient people aren't rich, and all obedient people are still subject to suffering. Can God bless us here and now? Yes, He can. He does, and sometimes He blesses us more than we could ever imagine. And the fact we are here, having sold this property, having purchased other property, entering the construction phase, is all a blessing from God. It is all God. But most benefits and blessings from someone's obedience are going to be in the afterlife. And that might seem unfortunate to some people because delayed gratification is something most people struggle with. The fact is that sometimes the only benefit and blessing from obedience that we might receive in this lifetime is the internal satisfaction and internal fulfillment from knowing that we met God's expectations, that we did what God wanted us to do. But even that earth time benefit is going to be expanded on in heaven. There are 6 words each one of us should want to hear from Jesus the moment we see Him in heaven. And those words are found in Matthew 25, verse 23, and those words are, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I am convinced that just over a month ago, Dow Jones heard those 6 words from Jesus in heaven. There's no doubt in my mind. Charles Hodge, a 19th century Presbyterian theologian, said the scriptures teach that the happiness or blessedness of Christians in the afterlife will be greater or less in proportion to someone's commitment to Jesus Christ during this lifetime. He said those who love little and do little are going to enjoy heaven less. And Mr. Hodge could be right about that. I read that in the middle of the last century, some older retiring missionaries were returning to the U.S. on a large passenger ship. This was before air travel was so common. The ship pulled into dock in New York Harbor, and as hundreds of passengers started to disembark, the couple noticed that there had been a well-known celebrity aboard that ship, and he was greeted with much fanfare. Waiting for him, there was a band and balloons and noisemakers, hundreds of people, and cameras flashing pictures. People seemed to be thoroughly excited to see this man, although these missionaries weren't sure who he was. But there was all of this fanfare. But then there was no one dockside to greet these missionaries. And so the two of them took their meager belongings, hailed a cab, and had the driver bring them to a modest hotel. It was a ride in silence until after some time had passed, the aged missionary said to his wife, "I don't understand this. It doesn't seem fair. We have expended our entire marriage in a distant foreign culture, ministering to underprivileged people, feeding them, clothing them, providing them medical care, teaching the illiterate people to read, and most important, telling them about Jesus. And as people were being converted, we formed a church, and then a second church, and a third church. We sacrificed, and we made a difference. And then we returned home to the States, and absolutely no one is here to meet us. There's no one here to appreciate all that we did. It just doesn't seem fair." This man's wife nodded, but then said, "I understand no one's here to greet us. And no, there's not going to be a reception." But she said, "That's okay. That's okay. Because remember, we're not home. And neither are we." Let's bow our heads in prayer, would we? And the worship team can come as I pray. Father, there's so much to learn in this small book of Ruth. Every man in this room should want to be like Boaz. He was a godly man. You blessed him for that commitment to you. And he made an amazing husband because he was faithful to be the protector, provider, and priest or pastor to his mate. So we're grateful for this example, and there's so much more to learn, and I'm excited about that. But I pray you will continue to keep your hand on our church. Do things for us behind the scenes that we aren't even aware of until they emerge in public. So we commit all of this to you. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.